For those of you who listened last week or were here last week, you know that we had finished the book of Ephesians. And I kind of stumbled into the next book, the book of Philippians, because I felt like just because of a lot of different circumstances, perhaps in my life and what I was seeing in the lives of others, maybe in this midsummer time, we needed some thought about joy. And I'd always been told that this book of Philippians was a book written about joy. And so last week we noted that the book of Philippians is kind of dealing with an undercurrent in that congregation, that group of Christians. And there's bickering and there's fighting and there's arguing. And we kind of noted Paul's prayer where he said, I pray that you might grow in love so that you might know what is important and what is not important, and you might choose what is important. And we kind of floated this idea that maybe we could find more joy if we could unite around that which is really important, and on the things that are not so important that we disagree on so easily, we refuse to argue about those. We give freedom in those areas, and maybe that would give us more joy. Well, this week, I began to read beginning in verse 12 and went down through about verse 25. And I was trying to see, is there something there about joy? I quickly set it aside. And I picked up a book that had been sitting on my desk just for a day or two that I'd ordered. And this book's about what I would call unconventional leadership, written by the founder and CEO of Hobby Lobby, David Green. David Green is 80 years old. He's been dealing with Hobby Lobby for 50 years. Started with nothing, and now the business is worth about $8 billion. And he's telling, at least in the first half of the book or so, all the struggles and how they did not know how they would make it and how they didn't see any way forward. And as I characterize what I think he's saying in at least the first half of the book or so, as he's giving his own personal leadership thoughts, I think there are two ideas that come forth. Burke has them on the screen for us. One is, I think he's saying God is always present. All through these 50 years that I've been working with Hobby Lobby, God has always been present. The second is, He has always been working, even when I didn't understand how He was going to work. So he'll tell the story in the book about the pandemic and how he had 50,000 workers and how when in a certain state, the first 19 stores closed and how ultimately all the stores closed and how he and his wife, he said, would go every morning, every noontime, and every night, and we would get on our knees and we would pray together. How are we going to make payroll? How are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? Is this the end? Until suddenly, some of the stores started opening back up, and he said people still couldn't get out and about. And he said, I guess they wanted to do arts and crafts. And he said, in the last half of that year, we sold more than we'd sold at any time in our history. And he said, God is always present. He's always working. Well, then I thought about Paul in that first chapter of the book of Philippians in regard to those two principles. But before I tell you what I thought, I want to ask you this question. Burke will put it on the screen. I know it was the 4th of July holiday week, but how was your week? Really, how was your week? And if someone said to me this morning, my week was full of problems last week, I could understand that. Or if someone said, last week I had all this stress, I could understand that. If someone said, I got really bad news last week that I did not want to get, did not expect to get, I can understand that. If someone said so boldly, My week last week was a no good, lousy week. I would understand that too. Because we all know, and we've all said it over and over again, life is really, really difficult. And so I think it was on July the 4th that Suze was telling me that she had 2 separate texts from people in faraway place, and then a phone call. And all 3 of these situations were situations where people were so miserable with their circumstances and things weren't working right. And in each of these situations, they could say, I am having a no good, lousy week. So the next question came. The next question was, how did you live this past week? If those circumstances are like I just described, how did you really live? How did you take it? What was your perspective? What was your attitude? What was your demeanor in the midst of all these hard times that come so often in life? And then I go back to Paul in the first chapter of the book of Philippians. Because Paul is saying in the early verses of the book of Philippians that I am in Roman chains. I am in a prison. It's in Rome. I'm in chains. Now, I don't care how you look at life. If you've been in chains this last week, literal chains, in kind of a Roman setting, you would look at this last week and say, it's been a tough week, and you might even say, it's been a no good, lousy week, if you've been in chains. And then I began to think about Paul's life. I know in his early life, it almost seems in his early life, he was born with what we call a silver spoon in his mouth. It seemed like everything was good. It seemed like he got to go to the best schools. It seemed like he came from a life of prominence. But then he encountered Jesus. And on that road to Damascus, he encountered Jesus, and nothing was ever the same. I mean, nothing was ever the same. When he entered into the kingdom, when Ananias said to him, Saul, what are you waiting for? Get up and get baptized and wash away your sins. From that moment forth, I'm telling you, his life was tough. He was chased. From that very moment, he was chased. And sometimes they caught him. And sometimes when they caught him, they would beat him. And he was chased, and sometimes they caught him, and not only would they beat him, but they would put him in the prisons. And he says 3 different times, I was shipwrecked. We only have one of those encounters, but if the other 2 were like the one, I can hardly imagine what it would be like being in the blackness of the night with a raging storm in a small wooden vessel, being bounced back and forth and having that vessel break apart, and you'd be floundering in the water. Once he was bitten by a poisonous snake. And then he had something wrong with him. We don't have any idea what it was, but he had something wrong with him. Some kind of affliction. Maybe it was painful. Maybe it was a nuisance. And he said, I asked God to take it away. And I did it more than once. I did it 3 times. Will you take it away? And God said, no. It's not in the plan. So I found myself wondering how many times in Paul's life could he look back over the week and say, it was a no good, lousy week. Just a lot of messes this week. And yet I want you to listen or read with me verses 12 and 2 or 3 verses following out of chapter 1. And as you read these verses, I want you to see if you can determine what his attitude was or his perspective was or how he was feeling in these Roman chains. So look beginning in verse 12. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. Now, short verses. What do you feel about Paul as he says those words? Do you see that he may be exuberant? Though he's in chains, do you see that he may be excited? Do you think that maybe even he's speaking in words that might have some joyfulness to them, even though he's in that kind of a circumstance? And I wonder if Paul understood those two principles. The two principles would be God is always working, and the second is he's always present, or vice versa. I wonder if Paul really understood that. Because in that same city of Philippi, his first encounter there, his first visit there, they put him in chains. And before they put him in chains and put him in the dungeon, they beat him with a Roman beating. And yet in that very night, he saw that God was there and God was working, though he didn't understand it. Now, the question for all of us is, do we really believe that? Do we really believe that? And do our lives reflect that, regardless of the week and its circumstances? So I want to remind you of two old stories, just two old stories. And I say old stories because you know them backwards and forwards, and I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed as I start talking about them. And yet, I want you to see them maybe from a little bit different perspective. The first story is about those descendants of Abraham and how they ended up in Egypt. Now, they were called the children of Abraham or the children of Isaac or the children of Jacob, and Jacob got his name changed. They called the children of Israel. That's what we normally call them. But they end up in Egypt. But they end up in Egypt as slaves. They're forced every day into slavery. And in that slavery, it's not uncommon for the Egyptian taskmaster to use the whip to enforce their labor. And so this goes on week after week and lifetime after lifetime. And I suspect that any given week, they could come home from the labor and sit around the house and say, it has been another no good, lousy week. And though they had heard about God, though the stories maybe had been passed down, they had no experience. Because this has gone on their lives, their parents' lives, their grandparents' lives, their great-grandparents' lives. It's gone on a long time. I mean, I went out for a little while yesterday afternoon to the Cowden reunion. And the only one left that was my dad's contemporary was one man, and he was just barely hanging on. But so much has disappeared. That's one generation back. They're talking about generation after generation after generation. And then Moses comes. And Moses comes, and they begin to see God. Because there are these plagues that come upon the Egyptians. They've never seen anything like it. The world's never seen anything like it. It's the hand of God. And they get to leave Egypt. But I want all of you to understand that this faith-building thing is slow. And it's not instantaneous. And this idea of understanding so clearly in my mind that God is always present when sometimes it doesn't feel like it. And this idea to understand that God is always working when sometimes I can't see where He's working. It doesn't come instantaneously. So they get to leave Egypt. But they got to learn more about this faith thing. They could have left Egypt and they could have gone this short distance. They could have crossed a river. They could have been there. But God says, no, I want you to go this other way. And they end up beside a sea. And they just camp there, not knowing where they're going to go next. But while they're camped by the sea, they notice the dust beginning to rise out there in the desert. Then they figure out the dust is coming from the wheels of chariots, 600 chariots to be exact. Then as it gets closer, they figure out that these are Pharaoh's chariots. And Pharaoh's coming with a vengeance or revenge. And you know what they do? They fall apart. Now, at that point in the story, that doesn't bother me at all. That does not bother me one tiny bit. Because when suddenly, I don't care how big your faith is, when suddenly you get the bad news or suddenly something happens, we all fall apart. We all get anxious. We all get to wondering. But they don't get over it. And they just keep saying really bad things to Moses, like, Moses, you've gotten us in such a mess. And Moses, we tried to tell you to leave us in Egypt. And Moses, we'd rather die making bricks with the whips on our back than die here like this. But you know what happens. The waters part. They stand up in tall walls, apparently, heaps up. And they get to cross over the seabed. And it's dry. And they get to the other side, and they get to look, and here comes Pharaoh with all those chariots. And the water comes caving back in. And now they make their way to that river. And God says, well, wait a minute, don't go over yet. Send some spies over. Now, God doesn't need the spies. They need the spies. They need to grow in their confidence. And the spies are gone for a long time. That probably made them nervous. The spies are gone for 40 days. What could take so long? And the spies come back, and most of the spies say, it's beautiful over there. It's good over there. But we just can't get over there. Because some of the people are giants, and the ones that aren't giants, they're well fortified, and they got all this armor, and they live in these big cities, and we go over there, we die. And all the people listen to the negative 10. And they panic again. Now, the interesting thing is, they never cross over. They never cross over. Everyone who's old enough to know better, they never cross over. They spend the next 40 years wandering out there in the wilderness. They just keep going and keep going and keep going. You know what I think? I think they can say every week of their lives, for their remaining days of their lives, it's been a no good, lousy week. And I suspect they never had a piece of joy the rest of their lives. Because they didn't understand God. That He's always there. That He's always working. Now contrast that to the other story you know so very well in 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's a little shepherd boy, And he's got a job, and his job every day is going out and taking care of sheep for his father while his brothers get to go off and do other things. And I'm sure he's tired of the job at times. And so on this one day, his father says, you get to go and visit your brothers in the army of Saul, and it's probably like a vacation. And you can almost see him bouncing up and down with joy. I get to do something that's different from what it was all these other days. And I get to go see the big army. And he goes. And when he gets there, you can see him just so excited. He's bouncing around. But all the soldiers and the king himself, they're distraught. They're in hiding. Because across the way, the valley, are the Philistines. And they got a big old giant guy, and he comes out into the valley, and he calls out insults to them, and he gives them challenges, and they all quiver, and they hide. And for 40 days they've been doing that, and it's been what they might call a bunch of no good, lousy days. But here this bright little guy comes along, and he's so excited, and he says, I don't know what you're so worried about. Well, those are my words. I will go down there. I will go take this on. Now, why would you do this, David? Because I've learned the lessons. I've learned the lessons. Because even when I was still younger than this, I was out there and I was taking care of sheep, and a lion came, and what can I do against a lion? But God gave me a victory. And there was another time when a bear came, and what can I do against a bear? But God gave me the victory. Now, if I walk down there and meet that giant, how's it going to be any different? I was no match for a bear. I was no match for a lion. I'm no match for him. But what does that make any difference? God is always present. And God's always working. And in just a little while, he goes down there and he comes back. And I can imagine him having the head of that giant in one hand, holding it by the hair, because he sliced it off with a sword. He got the point that God's always present and God's always working. And I don't see at this moment in my life how we can end up at this place of joy unless we understand the same thing. Because you and I don't get a vacation from troubles. We really don't. We don't get a vacation from difficulties. We don't get a vacation from Satan interrupting the relationships in our home and Satan messing up our work and Satan messing up our congregations. We don't get vacations from that. But we can live with joy if we stop and say, God is always present. You know what David did? Read the Psalms. While I believe he lived his life with those attitudes, he really messed some things up. He really made some mistakes. And he really had some troubles. And in the Psalms, sometimes David will say, like you and I say, God, where are you? And he will say, God, when are you going to fix this? And he said, God, these people deserve to be taken care of in really bad ways. And then after he talks back to that for a little while, he'll come back and say, but I know. I know you're my rock. I know you're there. And I know you'll take care of it. Every psalm after psalm after psalm, that's how he talks. Do you want to live with joy? Do you want to live with joy? I just don't believe it's possible without this confidence that comes by faith. And God wanted us to be that kind of people. He wanted to bring to himself a kingdom of people through his son Jesus. That's why he sent Jesus, to bring to himself a kingdom of people who would walk through this life so very differently from all the others. Same problems, same diseases, same problems at work, same arguments, but walk through differently because we believe God is present and God is working in us. He's going to take care of us. And so we just have a different demeanor. It's called joy. Jesus is the giver of peace and joy in our lives.